There have been some signs in the past couple of weeks that they might be losing patience with the Russians. So having put all of that pressure on Zelensky, when he accepted the terms, then in theory the pressure moved on to the Russians, and that if they didn't follow through on ceasefires, massive sanctions should have followed. We can come back to what's happened in the past few days. But the issue is that it seems that the US seems to sort of keep giving them a little bit more room to maneuver. And if you're optimistic, they're giving them more rope to hang themselves. And they're now going to turn on the Russians if they think that they are trying to play the US. But that time, in truth, probably passed weeks ago.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Matthew Savill, the Director of Military Sciences at the think tank RUSI. Matthew is also on the UK government's Operations and Crisis team in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Matthew, thank you very much for joining us again.
Good afternoon. Good to be back.
President Trump and Zelensky have both said they will go along with this idea of unconditional talks in Turkey. I believe that's this Thursday, following that European ultimatum of a ceasefire, which I believe was supposed to end this evening. What should we be watching for from Russia in reaction to this?
I mean, there are two areas. The first is actually what's happening on the battlefield, what's happening in and around Ukraine, and then there is the messaging that they are putting out on, if you like, their terms and conditions, and whether there is any change in their ambition. I mean, if I start with that latter bit first, it doesn't look like there has been much in the way of a changed ambition from the Russians. If you both read between the lines and also see what Russian officials have been saying for the past couple of months, they're still pushing a pretty maximalist position. I think some of the discussions this week, Russian officials have hinted should be based on I think it was the Istanbul discussions that were made back in 2022. And those were a pretty harsh set of conditions in terms of what we understand. I mean, I can remember I was in government at the time, and there was a lot of talk about whether or not the Russians were really sincere, because what they put forward then were a series of conditions that would have resulted in the Ukrainians not disarming themselves, but being at a serious disadvantage in the future in terms of caps on capabilities, the size of their armed forces, their future political trajectory in terms of NATO, what they could or couldn't do in their own country, who they could accept support from. And if your listeners remember, those effectively terms were not surprisingly rejected, and a lot of the Russian myth making that has grown up sort of claims that that was as a result of dubious British interference, that somehow Boris Johnson was responsible for, if you like, stopping at a chance of peace, because the bloodthirsty British wanted the war to continue, and in fact it was because the Ukrainians were not surprisingly not prepared to accept some pretty harsh conditions. So if that is what they are basing this around, then it's unlikely that talks this week are going to really produce much that is material, assuming they take place. I mean, I would never say never, but for the time being, that the Russians are acting as if they're not really interested in stopping this anytime soon. And that does bring us back actually to the other thing, which is on the battlefield. They have varied their tempo of activity. They've made lots of statements about ceasefires, which have seen a drop in attacks, but they've still been attacking. And I think we should be looking out for what is it that they are striking, long range attacks, what's happening on the front line.
And in terms of those long-term aims of the Kremlin, have those really changed significantly since those original talks in Istanbul and what the Russians are asking for now?
I don't think so, although I will freely admit I'm not a deep Russia expert, and of course a lot of what the Russians say in public is designed to either elicit a reaction, to influence. They will be putting out, uh, in many respects, a potentially misleading message. But as people have said consistently, sometimes you just have to listen to what Putin says and take him at his word, because he's been quite consistent on what he wants for Ukraine, which is a country that is pulled into the Russian sphere of influence, is not a host for Western influence or military forces from NATO countries. And we've seen plenty of Russian officials recently, Sergei Lavrov and others, advancing very similar positions. And you might say that that is a negotiating stance, but the way that they are backing that up with continued attacks shows that they are still trying to force their way forward. At the very least, they will be entering into talks with maybe the aim of getting a temporary ceasefire in which they have as advantageous a position as possible on the ground, because I think they will be looking towards a future where they think the US will be less engaged in Europe and they could perhaps try again in relatively short order.
And i- within those long-term aims that we have seen Russia put forward, is there scope for a ceasefire at the moment? Is there any point in Russia's mind in going into a ceasefire when they can continue advancing on the ground, do you think?
If they think they can trade in a ceasefire for accelerating the removal of the US from the equation, then I think they would regard that as worthwhile. I think this is the bit where, being cynical, there are cross purposes at play in the various parties who are negotiating. I think President Trump and the US are genuinely trying to create situation where there is a permanent cessation of violence. So they want to end the war. I think that's genuine. The issue is that the terms and conditions that are being discussed, as we understand them, and of course, a lot of this might still be happening privately and that we don't know the details, but what we understand publicly in that which has leaked out is actually going to lead to a situation that could be quite unstable. And that is because the Russians will fall short of those big objectives. They won't have annexed all four oblasts that they're after. They won't have toppled the government in Kiev, and they might not have actually completely removed the prospect of significant Western involvement and engagement with Ukraine. So, from that perspective, you would expect them to try and come back for more. From the Ukrainian perspective, they will have 20% of their country under control of another, of a foreign hostile invader. They will have nothing in the way of compensation for war crimes and the damage that has been done. And they might have restrictions on Western international support, the coalition of the willing. This is all still subject to negotiation, but that is not a particularly satisfactory state of affairs. And let's say they accepted something that looked like it was permanent, which on paper ceded Crimea and large chunks of eastern Ukraine formally to Russia. I think that would potentially be politically untenable for the government. And so there's an incentive for both of these sides to reset, and then if they both assume the other will do something, start fighting again. It could be years down the line. So what you get is a frozen conflict that could go hot quite quickly, even though the US is attempting to draw a line under it.
And Trump has now said he could also go to Turkey himself. And, this idea of having a direct talk with the US president and militarily, in a way, rebalancing Europe was something that the Kremlin was really pushing for early on in this conflict. Uh, does Trump's presence in Turkey affect Russia's calculations on this at all, do you think?
I mean, it's so difficult to know this because the US position has been quite changeable, although to be critical, under the new administration, where opportunities have existed to show more favor to Russia, and I don't mean support them, but effectively give them more benefit of the doubt, that is the way that the US has leaned. In essence, they have recognized that Russia has a lot of leverage at the moment, but rather than trying to counteract it, they've sort of been going with it. Now, there have been some signs in the past couple of weeks that they might be losing patience with the Russians. So, having put all of that pressure on Zelensky, when he accepted the terms, then in theory, the pressure moved on to the Russians, and that if they didn't follow through on ceasefires, massive sanctions should have followed. We can come back to what's happened in the past few days. But the issue is that it seems that the US seems to sort of keep giving them a little bit more room to maneuver. And if you're optimistic, they're giving them more rope to hang themselves. And they're now going to turn on the Russians if they think that they are trying to play the US. But that time, in truth, probably passed weeks ago. This is the second or the third or maybe even the fourth go at getting some kind of ceasefire that's longer than a few days and isn't one that Putin has called for. And so I think the US have essentially ceded some of their negotiating leverage by leaning towards the Russian position. And if you're Ukrainian, it's probably quite frustrating, to say the least, that rather than being a Ukraine backer using that leverage, the US is effectively saying it's neutral in these talks.
Well, on the other side of the pond from America, European nations have threatened to go ahead with this new round of sanctions on Russia if there's no ceasefire in place tonight. Is it possible to bring these two armies to a halt at this point?
It's difficult to see sanctions achieving that in the short term. And that's for a couple of reasons. First, Russia, like all countries operating under sanctions, eventually those countries work out which ones can be subverted or avoided or ducked and which ones can't, and they adjust and adapt. And they have done that. And militarily, they are doing that with the backing of China, with Iran, and with North Korea. And that's because they're prepared to pay the financial pain, which they have also created insulation for the sake of improving their military capability or sustaining their military activity. And there are still things that the West could go after. My colleagues who look at financial security have persistently pointed out that sanctions on Russian trade and the economy are not being fully enforced. My team have done work on sort of the Russian military industrial complex, and there are components that are still sneaking through the system. But bringing that war machine to a stop is probably not going to happen in short order as a result of sanctions. So I think the Europeans stepping up on sanctions will be welcome, but it's not going to address the near term, the frontline battle and Russian stockpiles of weapons that they're already manufacturing.
Well, shortly after that ultimatum was made, Russia, of course, launched this series of strikes across Ukraine. Was that the kind of usual set of drone and missile attacks that we've unfortunately come to expect from Russia, or were these strikes designed to send a message back to Europe?
I think sometimes Russian strikes, particularly these large massed ones that consist of a mixture of missiles and drones, are planned quite a long time in advance. And so there's occasionally a connection made between those strikes and an announcement or something that has happened, which is, that really is a correlation, not causation. But they could call them off. And I think there's been a consistent message that Russia is not prepared to halt the totality of its military activity for the sake of international pressure, and particularly coming from Europe for the time being. Indeed, we've seen in the past month, even whilst the US has been notionally ratcheting up the pressure, some of the biggest Russian strikes that we have seen to date, with very large numbers of drones going in on a couple of occasions. And, we're talking sort of normally it's 80 to 90. I think there were a couple of days a few weeks ago where it was 130, 140, complemented by various missiles. And that is both sending a message about their confidence in their stockpiles, even if it might be covering up some losses, and showing that they still have the ability to reach out and try and overwhelm Ukrainian defenses. So I think, yes, there is some messaging going on there. I mean, what's happened in the past 48 hours is unfortunate in that the Europeans and a selection of leaders took the time and the trouble to go to Kyiv to call for this 30-day ceasefire, to coordinate with the US and set that out as a coordinated position. And then when the counter offer came in from Putin of different arrangements, that President Trump sort of sent out a message saying that the Ukrainians had better get to these negotiations, and then there might be a ceasefire. And so they've sort of undermined this joint position again, almost at the first opportunity.
Uh, and is it, I mean, you say undermine. Does it completely negate what Europe are trying to do there, or is there room for Europe to continue to effectively support Ukraine even while Trump changes tack as he has, as you said he did on the talks versus ceasefire idea?
I think the Europeans can still do plenty. They can provide military support, they can provide moral support, they can impose sanctions, they can hurt the Russians. The problem is that all of those things are better done in coordination with the US, uh, if not materially, at least rhetorically. And the fact that it is so obvious that even if they've got what they think is an agreement or the green light from the US administration, that does not prevent a shift in the US stance because they've taken a different perspective, even though they might have agreed something. I think that undermines the force of what Europe can do, in presentational terms, and it very clearly undermines the physical impact of what can be supplied. And what Europe hasn't yet done is in any way compensate for the reduction and the slowdown in US weapons and supplies, which we're sort of reaching the end of what was authorized in the Biden era. There has been a little bit authorized in the past week in terms of ongoing support to F-16s. I think the US has agreed a sale of Patriot missiles to Germany, air defense missiles, but there's been no sign that there is an onward export agreement there yet. Europe is talking about stepping up. What it's actually doing is sustaining European support. It's not yet in a position to, and hasn't started really taking on the additional burden of replacing US support.
And is there more elsewhere Europe could be doing to support Ukraine now outside of stuff it would need to buy in from America or need the green light on? I mean, we're hearing that another $1 billion is going to be sent to Ukraine using those Russian frozen assets. Is that the sort of thing that could make a difference in this war, or at least send a message to Putin?
Yes, Europe could provide more funding that enables Ukrainian defense industry to churn more out. I mean, the expansion of European defense industrial production of all kinds of things where they're either experimenting with new weapons or where they are expanding the production of old ones. I mean, drones are a good example, but they're also trying to create their own cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. That is all an area where Europe can help, particularly if they can also help source some of the components. Lots of external support is actually money that is going on European defense industry producing stuff that goes into Ukraine, although some of the costs are different. In terms of European stockpiles, though, everything that they would donate from their own supplies now is probably commensurately more expensive, not in terms of money, but it's capacity that Europe doesn't have. And Europe does have a medium term challenge of it's got to spend defense uh, money on rebuilding its own military. If you are assuming that there'll be less US involvement in Europe in the next few years because their attention is elsewhere and because they want Europe to do more, not unreasonable, that means German, industrial production has got to churn out more German tanks and German armored vehicles for the Bundeswehr, not so that they can be given to Ukraine. And that is an enormous dual challenge to both support Ukraine and improve European defensive capabilities.
As you say, this conflict is still going on the ground in Ukraine as well. I mean, there had been that moment of stagnation only a few months ago in Russia's assault especially in the Donbass earlier this year. Has Russia managed to regain any of that momentum or open a front that would be a big worry to Ukraine?
Not at the moment, and I think if I was feeling a bit concerned a few months ago, and you could see from the way that casualties were mounting, Ukrainians might be concerned. They might be a bit more optimistic is not the right word, but confident in their ability to hold close to current lines. The Russians are still advancing. Ukraine has, largely speaking, lost the incursion in Kursk. The points of pressure are still around the Donbass and a few other places. There haven't been any huge Russian breakthroughs, and I think the Ukrainians have stabilized their positions. There are, of course, still points of concern. First is that the Russian reduction in tempo is potentially because they are beginning to store up forces. They're literally, trying to bring in more armored vehicles and bring in more people to prepare to have a more significant push in the summer. Every sign is that the Russians are still meeting all of their recruiting targets. And this is voluntary recruitment. They're not being forced to mobilize people. They are getting volunteers in because they are increasing the bounties that they offer, effectively the payment. That means it's very expensive, but if they're prepared to pay that financial cost, they are replacing their losses. So the Ukrainians are not able to whittle them down. And in return, Ukrainian casualties are, they are also lower, but they are at the moment slightly harder to replace. They just have less of a pool to go into. The killing zone around the front line still makes it a very unhealthy environment for armored vehicles, although you still need them to get to close to the front. They're still highly valued. There is still this battle of the drones going on in electronic warfare, with artillery still playing a role, and the Russians have got, more artillery, although the Ukrainians managed to close the gap in terms of shells. I think we're starting to see more and more efforts by the Russians to evade or overwhelm defenders who are relying heavily on drones. And so they're both showing a pretty appalling disregard for their own forces' lives by throwing people on crutches or in wheelchairs. The walking wounded are being thrown back into the fight, and they are of limited direct military value, but they get killed, and that takes up another drone, or it takes up more fire, or exhausts the defenders. Meanwhile, they're experimenting with buggies and motorbikes and very, very mobile forms to try and evade Ukrainian drones, and that's not being wholly successful. And they haven't made huge breakthroughs there, but they have threatened in a few places because they're able to move around very rapidly. They're playing around with what they can do to more rapidly bring pressure to bear on the Ukrainian lines. And so I think we will continue to see this toying with tactics. Meanwhile, the electronic warfare fight to blind surveillance or jam it, or to detect where the other side is storing its drones, or where the drone operators are, or where artillery is positioned, to make it more difficult to bring that firepower to bear. This constant battle is going on. So I think what's happening is that the front line looks like it has certainly slowed its movements, but the tactic evolution and coming up with counter tactics is absolutely still happening.
And we've been hearing about the Russian push possibly into Dnipro Petrovsk. This region isn't even part of the sort of claimed annexation by Russia and the Kremlin of Ukraine. Is there anything Russia would really want with that territory, or is it just a matter of it's the only place they can advance?
Well, some of this is where they push on and they find advantage. Some of it is they have more people on the front, if you like. I mean, they have probably now, because they've managed to increase the numbers, maybe 620,000 or more people along the front line, that sort of 1,000-kilometer stretch. And the Ukrainians have mobilized maybe 800,000, but they don't have as many on the front. And that means the Russians have got a slight advantage in that they can push in multiple places. So they've been able to, with North Korean help, almost fully eject the Ukrainians from Kursk, and they're threatening Sumy. They've also been threatening towards Kharkiv. And then you sweep down to the south, and suddenly Kherson and Zaporizhia are both places where they've been pressing, and so they're pressing all the way along the front, and that is what exhausts the Ukrainians. They can't pull forces off that front line, and this hasn't radically changed. They've also got to maintain some kind of defensive position everywhere. And what we've seen with modern surveillance and with drones and with different ways you operate, the Ukrainians might be defending very large frontages with very small numbers of people who are very spread out, and they're able to defend those positions, particularly if they strengthen physical defenses. But it means that they're not densely packed, so they're less of a target. But if the Russians can get through and threaten somewhere with large numbers of people, it is commensurately harder for the Ukrainians to hold on to it. Because you might be talking of square kilometers of ground being held by a couple of dozen people. And so I think that the significance is in as much their ability to keep pressing everywhere. I think the Russians have not taken fully any of the places that were their key targets. Although if you look at, say, Touretsk or Chaziv Yar, those are essentially gone, but the Ukrainians are fighting on. So the success is the Ukrainians have denied them fully taking those positions. But the Russians are there in numbers, and there's some of those places like Chaziv Yar give them higher ground to threaten elsewhere. The Russians have not taken Pokrovsk. Uh, they've not even fully encircled it, but they are edging their way round. And this all matters in terms of the battlefield, partly because places like Kramatorsk and Sloviansk become more at risk, but also because it means that if there is a breakthrough, eventually, if there's no change in the balance of forces, the Russians will be able to make numbers work in their favor somewhere. And that's the challenge of the disadvantage that the Ukrainians face. So they need to find a way to essentially, kill more Russians, kill and injure more Russians to negate that numbers advantage.
And where should we be keeping an eye on then, or watching carefully for the rest of the year in terms of what Russia might target? I'm not just thinking, of course, of eastern Ukraine, but places like the border with Kursk as well.
So I definitely think there is an issue around the border, partly because they want to eject the very, very last of those Ukrainian forces. The past, I think, week has seen some interesting developments in that, having largely speaking left Kursk, the Ukrainians have been able to still raid back into Kursk. And that's true even in the past few days. And they've been threatening into Belgorod. So they haven't. The Russians have not been able to completely remove everybody who was up there and just shift them elsewhere. There is still some distraction taking place. Conversely, though, they are threatening into Sumy. And that means the reverse is true, that the Ukrainians have got to keep some forces there to protect Sumy, to protect the north. I think a retrospective analysis of the Kursk element of the campaign might conclude that the forces that chewed up, that the Ukrainians committed, were more valuable to them than the forces that the Russians ended up committing, or indeed the North Koreans, because that was mostly the Ukrainian reserve or reserve capacity that was used up there. And as we can see at the moment, it wasn't able to be traded into negotiations. So I think what we should be looking out for is, where do the Russians continue to be able to exert pressure where the Ukrainian ability to respond with pressure is limited? I think that the Donbass remains the main thrust, because what they really want to do is take the remaining territory of those, the four oblasts, which is Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, and Luhansk. That territory, which they've on paper annexed, will continue to be where they want to enact some kind of uh, de facto control leading to ideally de jure control.
And is that militarily, is that a realistic aim for this year?
At the rate at which they've been progressing, no. I mean, I think some people have done it depends on when you draw the line, but some people have done the calculations that it's sort of like another 10 years at rates of advance. I think the others, of course, I mean that's mostly for Kherson and Zaporizhia, Donetsk and Luhansk. If they tweak how they're operating and successfully kind of push through on some of those more vulnerable bits, maybe. And this, of course, is at the root of continuing to play for time whilst they eke out ground. And I think it is to the Ukrainians' credit that they managed to forestall those advances to such an extent that the Russians haven't made that progress that they might have thought they were going to make in, say, November.
Well, Matty Savill, thank you very much for speaking with me today on Frontline.
My pleasure.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can sign up for membership at the link below or subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also listen to the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or read it on thetimes.com. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.